Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and this week's presentation particularly relates to the revolutions of 1848 and the ultimate process towards unification of Germany, which doesn't occur until 1871. 1848 was a transformative time in Europe, and particularly in Germany. Um, the revolutions in 1848, and I say revolutions because there were literally um, liberal and radical revolutions across Europe in 1848, and they were influenced by events in France. France's leader Louis Philippe was overthrown in 1848, and as was the case during the French Revolution, as was the case during an uprising in France in 1830, this had long-term influence on Germany. Germany was really primed for revolution at this time. There was a growing radical movement. Germany, in a lot of respects, represented a collision between the realities of a new age and the realities of an old age. And the collision of these things, the new industrialism, the old monarchism, really created a lot of dissatisfaction and a lot of radicalism on actually both sides of the spectrum. There were ultra conservatives and there were ultra radicals. The radicals embody groups um, um, like Marxist, revolutionary, socialist movements. The radicals embody groups. There are groups that refer to themselves as Jacobins. The Jacobins was the radical wing of the French Revolution, and during these revolutions in 1848, those Jacobins were effectively communist revolutions. And actually, of course, the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, was, of course, published in 1848. And if any of you have ever read the Communist Manifesto, it's a very small work, and actually, it's really more of a precursor to the much more developed and advanced works of Marx and Engels that are published later. But the Communist Manifesto was designed to motivate radicals in the revolutions of 1848, workers, the proletariat. So Germany has a lot of tensions within it. And one of the big questions, of course, too, at this time is what is Germany? And one of the big national questions were what is Germany and how is Germany, how will Germany be created and what kingdoms will be included in Germany? But there's a radical call in Germany, particularly by radicals on the far left, communist and revolutionary movements, or what we're going to in the future basically know as communists, who were really responding to the ills of industrialism. The industrial system had been really, really bad for workers. There had been a collapse of the economy and the growing population. The economy, I really shouldn't say a collapse of the economy, but the economy wasn't able to fulfill the social needs of a growing population. The Industrial Revolution produces expanded populations. It changes work. Labor becomes more intensified. Much of the labor is lower paid, harder conditions. There's more people. And so the industrial system as it developed was very, very unable to deal with important social issues in terms of people's most basic needs, in terms of food and in terms of economic well-being. And so industrialism produces a very harsh and repressive social atmosphere. And so many radical movements in the 1840s were motivated particularly to address the social question, to address issues of inequality, of want, of poor workers' wages, of poor working conditions, and so forth that were occurring in Germany. And so there's a radical movement that is to a large degree a response to the ills of industrialism. You'll also see peasant uprisings, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And those uprisings were not attached to Marx's writing or to those radicals who are responding to industrialism and the exploits of industrialism. There's also a rising tide of German nationalism. Um, there is increasing, as there were engagements between France and Germany over, or the people of Germany over areas like the Rhine River. The French increasingly were encroaching on areas in the western area of Germany, and particularly the Rhine River. And this inspired growing sense of German nationalism. German nationalism was to a large degree built on advanced industrialism, on a resistance to the French, who were considered to be the ultimate sort of anti-German, also a resistance to the influence of Italy and the Vatican, and also to groups like the Poles, and also, of course, Jewish groups ultimately. Germany is really a product of creating a nationalism that centers around sort of vilifying in other that is both outside but also inside. And the French really, during the 1840s, became the sort of archetype for defining German nationalism. There's an increased call for a constitutional system at this time too, and the king at this time, Frederick William IV, was actually he was a conservative, but he was very astute in his understanding of calls for a constitutional system. When we say a constitutional system, we're talking about establishment of a parliament. We're talking about the establishment of a system that does not censor the media, of a system that allows for suffrage, for the vote, of a system that provides basic rights in terms of justice and so forth within the country. And Frederick William IV was astute, was in tune with these, and he actually helped motivate the call for parliamentary discussions and for the creation of a sort of monarchical constitutional system at the beginning of the revolutions of 1848. The Revolution of 1848 was really a combination of many revolutions. There were significant uprisings in Vienna, Austria, and actually Clemens von Metternich, the archetype of the old German Confederation during the post-Napoleonic era, was forced to flee Vienna. In Berlin, Berlin became the place of significant protests and demonstrations. And actually, Frederick William IV had agreed to certain constitutional relaxations, to ending censorship, to calling for the creation of a parliament, and these types of things. And people were organizing in the streets of Berlin, and there was a rather misguided military engagement of the people in Berlin on March 18th that turns into a bloody street battle in which over 200 people are killed in Berlin. And Frederick William IV was very upset by this, and he very much, encouraged the creation of a kind of parliamentary monarchy after this. During the revolutions of 1848, I say there's many revolutions. There's revolutions that are liberal-motivated revolutions for constitutional governments that are led by very significant figures. There are of the middle class and the bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie. There are also peasant uprisings. In the countryside, Central Europe still had many of the old kinds of symptoms of the old feudal system, of a peasant kind of serf class that worked the land. And there were significant peasant uprisings in the countryside. The peasant uprisings were almost universally opposed by just about every major group not associated with the peasant uprisings. Conservatives, liberals, even workers supported by folks like Karl Marx were really generally opposed to the peasant uprisings. There were also workers' rebellions throughout the realm of Central Europe and Germany, and your textbook refers to these as an orgy of Luddism. Luddism is a term that refers to the action of the Luddites in Great Britain in the early 1800s. To give you a little background on this, the Luddites had reacted to the ills of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, in the textile industry in the early 1800s, by revolting against the factories and destroying the machines that embodied the early Industrial Revolution. And the reason is because the machines were really destroying the way of life for workers and artisans. Before the Industrial Revolution, artisans and workers were highly skilled craftspeople who provided a service that was highly needed and was well paid and was highly skilled. Well, the Industrial Revolution, of course, mechanizes things. And the result of this is that many of those skilled laborers, whether in the textile industry or what, have their skill basically eliminated. And their skill is replaced by mechanization and machines. And this destroys their pay. This destroys their entire enterprise as individuals. And instead, they're forced to work for lower wages, working dirty and dangerous factory conditions that were loud, noisy, in which they worked longer hours at the dictate of a foreman. Before, it was all done in their own communities, and now they're at the dictate of the foreman, of the clock tower. They're at the dictate of machines, and they're paid less in these worse, harsh conditions. And workers rebelled from this, and in many cases, the author describes an orgy of Luddism. And what that basically means is that they were revolting and destroying the implements of the industrial and the factory of the industrial age. This was hardly what Marx and Engels intended from the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Marx saw and Engels saw industrial capitalism as necessary. They didn't expect workers to revolt and destroy the industrial reality. They wanted workers to rebel and seize the means of production and create effectively workers' cooperatives that controlled the industrial process. So the workers' rebellions were rather disconnected and really lacked a central direction that Marx and Engels had hoped and intended from the 1848 Communist Manifesto. And of course, Marx and Engels' theory that the workers would somehow rebel in a sort of unified sense was, of course, highly wishful thinking, if you will, anyway. And it doesn't play out this way. The Revolution of 1848 may be thought of as a failed opportunity for unified Germany. The revolution, as I mentioned on the previous slide, had many channels. There were radical aspects who sought fundamental social change. There were radical workers' revolts who were very much kind of localized to their particular area. There were radical peasant uprisings. There will be a ultra-conservative and a conservative counter-revolution. And there's also a more kind of middle-of-the-road, liberal, middle-class revolution. The liberals in Germany, in what becomes Germany, in the kingdoms comprising Germany, the German Confederation, liberals were not the same as radicals. As I've mentioned in previous discussions, liberals were deeply fearful of the ramifications of radical social reform. Liberals generally supported basic ideas that were put in place during the French Revolution, things relating to the creation of a constitution that grants suffrage, that creates a representative government in which the people have certain freedoms and rights owed to them, the end of censorship, these types of things, the end of monarchical control, usually taking the form of a constitutional monarchy. So liberals in Germany were really moderates, and they represented, by and large, middle-class individuals. The Frankfurt Parliament, which is a meeting of about 600 people in Germany, meeting at Paul's church. The Frankfurt Parliament was designed to create a new German constitution, a new German state. It's centered on the so-called German question, the national question. And so the Frankfurt Parliament met to create and unify the German state. It also, in many respects, represented um, a moderate component of the Revolution of 1848. The people represented at the Frankfurt Parliament initially were moderate liberals. They were not radicals. The vast majority of them um, were not radicals or ultra-conservative radicals. They were kind of moderate, middle of the road, educated people. They represented the academics. There was something, I think it was like, there was almost 50, I think it was 48 that represented higher education, professors. There were lawyers. And by and large, the kind of ultra-conservative monarchists were not represented. And the radicals who had been represented by peasants or um, or artisans were not represented very much either. So the Frankfurt Parliament sought to meet and effectively do what was done during the French Revolution, create a new constitution, a new type of government that will unify Germany. As this is all happening, of course, there's a counter-revolution that is very much putting down many of the more radical aspects of the revolution, and the counter-revolution will be very successful in Austria. Many had taken, at the Frankfurt Parliament, many had assumed that the Austrian Empire was over, that it was broken, that it could never be restored. But the counter-revolution in Austria was actually very, very successful. And as a result of this, the German question, how to unify Germany, will center largely on the issue of Austria and various aspects of the German kingdoms that were part of trying to create this new unified country will hinge their position on the basis of where Austria stands. And Austria will ultimately crush the revolution and reconsolidate the Austrian Empire. And there are some calls from Austria that the Austrian Empire would be made part of this new unified Germany. But this ran counter to the very notion of a unified Germany. And so the Austrian question really hinged on the success or failure of whether or not there would be a unified Germany as a result of this. Initially, the revolution had some success, and then the resurgence of the counter-revolution, difficulties over Austria, really led to the failure of the Frankfurt Parliament, and it largely dissolves without the construction, the creation of any truly unified Germany. Germany was unified to a large degree by the works of a Prussian, Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian Junker. Otto von Bismarck, who is in the image here, becomes known as the Iron Chancellor. Otto von Bismarck was largely a royalist. He was a Prussian military man. However, and he is the architect of the unification of Germany. And it's important to note that while he leaned towards royalist as a Prussian elite military man, he was a realist. And it's really Otto von Bismarck that creates the mantra of Realpolitik. And Realpolitik basically means that you do what is in the interest of the country as a whole. You do that over what might be your ideal. And so Otto von Bismarck will cobble together a very interesting German empire, a unified Germany and a unified German empire that was sort of a compromise of every level. It was a constitutional monarchy, and so it compromised aspects of monarchialism, the old ultra-conservatism, with aspects of the liberalism, and it created this kind of hodgepodge of this new unified German state. A state that had no national flag, it had no national anthem, and it had almost nobody that was a true devotee of it. But it was the kind of savvy and leadership capabilities of Otto von Bismarck that really made it happen. his leadership is really fundamental for achieving stability in what otherwise was a very divided empire. Otto von Bismarck was about action, and that's why you see this quote here. He reacted to the revolutions of 1848 and 49. He says, you know, this was a lot of talk and no action. And so Otto von Bismarck's a man of action. And to a large degree, he will use war with outside powers, the Danish, the French, and the Austrians. He will use conflict as a way of unifying Germany against an external other. The wars of unification were fought particularly against Denmark, the Danish, the Austrians, and the French. And these were fought over disputes over German territory. Remember, the unification of Germany centers to a large degree on the perspective of areas of people who are considered to be of the German Volk, the German people. And Otto von Bismarck largely describes Germany to some degree through linguistics, through the German language. And he very much felt that all people that would be brought under the control of Germany, whether they were Polish or not, should speak German. And the German language would be at the centerpiece of this new German state. The war with the Danes, with Denmark, in 1864 was fought over claims to territories of Schleswig and Holstein. In 1866, there was a showdown for dominance in Central Europe, and this leads to Germany vying for power with Austria. And ultimately, these huge successes will overwhelm any parliamentary opposition to this kind of Prussian-dominated, militaristic, and sort of monarchist system. And this painting here depicts one of the most famous battles during the Austro-Prussian War. Following these two conflicts, you will see the Prussians create effectively a North German Confederation that is dominated by an expanding and influential Prussian leadership. This is a look at these maps just depict the expansion of Prussian influence in the 1860s. Prussian expansion in 1864 during the Danish War, and you see where Schleswig and Holstein were. And these were areas that were, because of their area on the border, were areas of natural territorial disputes between the Danes and the Prussians. And Otto von Bismarck uses these disputes to build up the national sentiment of German unity by using an outside force, an outside grievance, to create a sense of German identity. Below you see the North German Confederation of 1867 to 1871, following the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, in which Prussian influence has increasingly expanded and is moving into the creation of modern Germany. The Franco-Prussian War was the last of these three wars that are fought for the, really the consolidation of a Prussian-dominated and a unification of Germany. The Franco-Prussian War was to a large degree fought for domination over continental Europe. Napoleon III, who had a lineage to Napoleon Bonaparte, had sought to yet again make France a great continental power, and he sought to expand French influence, particularly in areas in southern Germany. And this leads to an engagement, a war between the Prussians and the French, in which the French are decisively defeated at the Battle of Sedan on September 1st, 18 1870, in which the French are forced to surrender a massive army that included their leader, Emperor Napoleon III. Germany is really at this point a product of unification from above, meaning it was a product of measures and actions taken largely by the elite Junker class and aristocratic class led by Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck, of course, used a series of wars to unify Germany, and the most significant was the war against the growing and sort of universal opponent to Germany, the French. And this is the crowning of Wilhelm I as German emperor at the Palace of Versailles, the great French palace that was the building of Louis XIV. And this occurred on January 28, 1871. Bismarck's in the white uniform. And this signifies a unification of Germany from above. It signifies coming and long-term tensions between France and Germany, as this is occurring in defeated France, outside of Paris. This is symbolic of the coming tensions that will continue to exist between Germany and France over border territories like Alsace and Lorraine. And so this is a very significant moment, and it flies in the face, really, of the revolutions of 1848 that had been motivated by many to create a German nation from the middle classes, and instead the German nation is unified and created by the motivations, the military motivations of the aristocratic Prussian Junker state. The German Empire, which begins in 1871, was really a very uneasy compromise between the figures of federal and state authority, between supporters of monarchy and democracy, and between proponents of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. It's a kind of an odd conglomerate. It has no national anthem. It has no national flag. The Reich is basically its national government, and it controls foreign policy, economic and social policy, and federal law. But it's a country. It's a country that's really held together and created by Otto von Bismarck, and is one that very few people have kind of a passionate devotion to. But it's in its early phases of creation. As German nationalism forms, it really forms against an outside other, the French, for example, the wars of unification, but it also forms largely around an internal other. And this takes us to the question of nationalism. Nationalism, the modern nation, is what we would call an imagined community. And this is a term that comes from a very famous book that was written about 30 years ago by a scholar named Benedict Anderson. And an imagined community is basically the idea that individuals within a nation perceive themselves as participating in an imagined community with other people, sharing certain traits that are imagined because, of course, you don't ever see all those people, right? But you have a participation in an imagined group of people that theoretically all share the same kind of qualities. There are civic nationalisms, which today modern countries generally seek to pursue a civic nationalism. Civic nationalisms means that the unity of a country is based on shared ideals of freedom, of democracy, justice, basic ideological principles about what your country and your nation means. Generally, even though there's still resistance to this in the United States, generally the United States fashions itself today in the current modern age. It wasn't always this way, but as a civic nationalism, meaning that anybody can be an American, whether you're Italian or Chinese or Japanese or English or Hungarian or whatever it may be. Anybody can ultimately be an American, part of the United States citizenry, because of a shared participation in basic ideas of constitutional government, of constitutional freedoms, of individual liberty, of natural rights, and so forth. We all share these principles of justice and fairness, and that's what makes our nation today, and most of the nations of the world, generally aspire towards a civic nationalism. Most of the developed nations, meaning that it has nothing to do with your ethnicity or your race, but rather your national identity is part of your participation in fundamental ideas about your um, about your nation. The other form of nationalism, which we can still find in the world today, though it's less and less common in the modern first world today, but was very common during the 19th century, is ethnic nationalism. And ethnic nationalism is basically a unification on the basis of a feeling that what makes the nation is a racial or ethnic sharing, meaning that the people of the nation define themselves as being part of this nation because they consider themselves to be part of a particular ethnic or racial group. The German Empire of the era from 1871 through the development of Nazi Germany is really a product of the latter. It's a product of ethnic nationalism. It's a product of a nation that's created on the basic principle that Germans represent a particular race or ethnicity, and that you can only really be a true part of the German nation when you are effectively German in an ethnic or racial sense. Within Germany, at this time, within the German Empire, there are competing identities. Um, German nationalism is formed largely against the vilification of both the external, war with people like France and Denmark over bordering territories like Schleswig-Holstein or Alsace-Lorraine, but also an internal vilification of ethnic others. The Polish people in places like Posen, and also Jewish people who have been living in Germany and Central Europe for generations. Polish nationalism was a big question because much of Poland was part of the German. Poland wasn't really an independent nation at this time. It was being made part of the new German nation. And many Poles had a unique nationalism. For Bismarck, the key to the solution here was language. He believed that everyone should speak German, whether they were Polish people in Posen or not. He believed that everyone should speak German, and eventually the shared language would allow for everybody to effectively be conjoined in a shared, effectively ethnic German nationalism. And this was really agreed upon by other liberals and also radicals like the followers of Karl Marx, who believed that Poland, because it was a non-industrialized sort of semi-feudal area, believed that Poland was backwards, and that if Poland was allowed to become an independent nation, it would be a huge step backwards. And so these individuals believed that Poland should be effectively made German, and that Polish people should have to um, speak German and basically join in the German nation and effectively rid themselves of their Polishness, if you will. Similarly, the Jewish question was also becoming very significant at this time. Jews had been emancipated in Germany, though there were still certain impediments to their upward mobility. But in terms of a state in which they had basic political rights, Jewish people had received emancipation, and this was one of the great motivations of liberal figures during the revolutionary period and during the national unification of the country, that Jewish people should be emancipated. And Otto von Bismarck supported the emancipation of German Jews. But Jews still faced certain impediments when it came to their full participation in the society. And Jews made up many of the more skilled professional activities. Many professors were Jewish. Despite their small population number, they were very successful in the banking industry. They were very successful in professional disciplines like the medical fields. Many were doctors and academics, and many made up professors. And this created some level of further ire in the German state towards Jewish individuals. Most Jewish individuals um, sought assimilation, and many Jewish individuals even went against fundamentals of their religion when it came to acknowledgement of the Sabbath, and the types of food you eat, and these types of things. Many Jewish people kind of cast a blind eye to that, as out of an effort to assimilate to the German nation. And there's really only a small percentage of what we call Zionists in Germany at this time. Zionists were Jewish nationals who sought to go to the area of Palestine ultimately and create a new a nation of Israel, a new Jewish homeland. Most Jewish people in Germany were not Zionists. They were generally seeking assimilation with Germany, but by and large, their assimilation was largely, like the full assimilation was actually prevented. And it was prevented largely because of impediments that the German state placed upon Jewish people. During the late 19th century, we see a fundamental change in anti-Semitism, and you find this change also relevant to other ethnicities and cultures throughout the world. And this is a product largely of a pseudoscience that's developing alongside of imperialism during the 19th century. And this was the concept of race. The concept of race, guys, is a human construct. Sometimes we think that, race just referred to people seeing people look different than them or practice different ways of being than them. That is not what one means when they say race. The term race, the idea of different races in the world, was actually a creation of imperialists in the 19th century. And it was a way that imperialists came to define the world from the perspective of different racial groupings. And different racial groupings, it's all made up, and it's based on a pseudoscience. There's no legitimate science to this, but imperialist figures and imperialist scientists created a racial hierarchy in which different peoples were ascribed to different racial categories, and these different racial categories had or were ascribed certain racial qualities and characteristics, and these characteristics were ascribed by pseudoscientists as potentially capable of polluting the higher races. And so in the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, there's a significant movement in many of the Western European nations, the United States included, to prevent race mixing, to prevent different races from being able to participate wholly in your nation, and to prevent and to alienate and isolate other races on the basis of the perspective that these other races would somehow pollute a higher race, which was generally defined as being white and European. So during the late 19th century, we see the development of racism applied to the other in the new nation state. And the other included different groups, but particularly it is increasingly directed at the Jew, who is constructed as the eternal foreigner, the person incapable of ever becoming truly German. Historically, Jewish people had been persecuted because of religion. Now it is because of race. Race being this fallacy, this construct that was created by pseudoscientists during the imperial age, in which the Jewish individual is now constructed as part of an allegedly inferior race that threatened to potentially pollute the makeup of the higher German and European race. And so this classification of Jewish people as a lesser racial other effectively eliminated any chance that the Jewish people could ever truly assimilate to this nation at this time, and instead it effectively pushed the Jewish individual out as an eternal and racial other that is going to be seen as separate from the German nation from within. and German nationalism during this period will, to a large degree, be built on this internal racialization of anti-Semitism.